Going to be talking about a few different things on Trump and disputing a couple different claims. Number one, we're going to be going after how he's actually handled the actual budget. Number two, we're going to be how he's actually handled jobs. And number three, we're going to be going after the claim that he's actually pro-life. Now, first of all, with it is how he's actually handled the budget. We can actually look at the thing by going back to 2016 when we actually enter it. This time in 2016, we had about 20 trillion in debt. We go over just to the 2020 mark, and we can see that he's added already $7 trillion in debt. Now, if you were to do this, especially during a period in which we are going into the higher period of the business cycle, where we're still getting uh, a positive on the business cycle, he should be actually cutting debt specifically during this period with it. I mean, even if you believe in the Keynesian economic model with it, you would still want to have some type of movement happening on when you get into a downside, which is what we're entering in right now. And what he was doing during this whole period was exploding debt. I mean, if we look at the going back, we can actually see that the debt per citizen has actually gone up about seven. We're talking about $26,000 just within 4 years, and or sorry, talking about $21,000. Sorry, I mistook the number. So it's about $21,000 over 4 years, and that's irresponsible. You're talking that's basically going up by about a third of the size of it, and that's because we're talking. He's almost added another what will probably end up being by the end of the year, near nearly basically getting up to that $30 trillion amount. Especially when we're talking about adding in some other type of stimulus, which is likely, and when we start to add that in, you're talking that that's going to add the national debt up to about $30 trillion. And when you start to look at that compared to, let's say, for instance, the next part is you want to look at the U.S. workforce. U.S. workforce back in 2016 would have been about 153 million, just shy of 154 million. U.S. workforce now is 147 and change. So we've actually lost 11 million jobs since he's actually been. You can actually see the actual difference just in 2000 with it. It actually pretty much what Obama had with it in the end of 2016 was about the same as it was in 2000. So it didn't really change. From 2000, there was pretty much a steady workforce amount. Now, what we have not in the workforce with it is over 100 million people. And this is right now where we're basically finding that not many people are basically coming in. Now, another thing he usually wants to tout is the amount of median income. Now, only since 2000, this includes George W. Bush as well. There's only been about 45, actually about not even about we're talking less than $4,000 added on top of that. So that's basically we're talking only a little bit above 1% of the income since that point, and that's over 20 years. So we're talking about maybe about a half of a percent of income uh, since basically 2000. That's George W. Bush, Obama, and him. So we've only since that point have only added about per year about a half of a percent. Now that's not exactly what we're talking to be positive. As far as I know, we do not have those records going into it. But when you start to look at the amount uh, that we need that he's actually done with the trade deficit, we're talking which is what he was trying to reduce, whether he was trying to basically get us to actually produce more goods and ship them out, raise manufacturing amounts. Now we've actually produced record amounts of trade deficit right now with it because we're not producing anything. Um, Also, when it comes down to our debt to GDP ratio, going into 2000, we were only at 55.81%. We're now all the way up to 137.47%. If you go back into 2016, that number would have been, let's see if we actually got a percentage on here. Okay, out here with it, it's the about 106.17%. Uh, out here with it, so we're talking, it's actually gone up by about a third with it because he's just not actually reducing the amount of spending. And that's basically at the top of the business cycle. We haven't not gone down yet into a recession period, which we will. And this is actually the start of the recession period. And that's one of the things that needs to be noted. And he can keep making all these excuses about not being able to cut debt, but it's very, very easy to cut debt. All you need to do is first step is let the budget expire. It gives you a couple weeks for contingency things for those who are getting paid. And then what ends up happening is you have votes in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and you vote for what is not controversial. And what ends up happening is they're going to vote for what's not controversial. Those votes will get voted up, and everything is passed through. And you're going to find out that you're going to have a budget far smaller, and you can actually severely reduce the debt. He could have actually pretty much chewed up, probably within 4 years, probably about half that debt that we are at, if not at least about a third of it within that time. But instead, he's actually going to at least add another $10 trillion dollars to that debt. Now, people are going to be asking, well, what are some other problems with him with it? Well, the problem being is he's done policies that are actually against it. Now we're finding that these tariffs. Now, where are the tariffs coming from? Now, if you actually look at where it's actually paid, the tariffs are actually paid by the citizens. And what ends up happening is the citizens, on average per family, it ends up being close to about $1,200 a family, which is currently. He actually states that he wants to double it if reelected. This is not something in which is very, very popular because when it comes down to the actual household wants more money. Even within members of his party, Ron Johnson, who's in my home state of Wisconsin, has stated that he thought Trump was only going to do it for a couple of weeks and then was going to try to get a deal and then immediately remove him. This is not what has happened. In fact, what's happened is we found that Trump has kept them on and made them even worse. And we find that this has actually made it very, very hard for a lot of people. He's actually done tariffs that have actually hurt the industries that he meant to help because he's putting tariffs on industrial metals, which are actually right after the processing point of right after ore, it gets the industrial metal point, and these are exactly what our fabricators need to make their products. Now, if you actually take this stuff away and you make it more costly, it makes it more difficult for them to get the products they need, and they have to lay off these workers because the fact is they don't have the cost efficiency in the company to make it worthwhile. Now, this is something in which he's done countless times in his administration, and it's made it worse. So you see him adding a lot of debt. You see him not understanding on the where we are in the business cycle, and you see him adding tariffs. Now, these are massive things that are actually hurting jobs. Now, when you start to add debt, it's going to make us less of a viable trade partner because our currency is well inflated, And then he's adding tariffs, which are basically going to be punishing those who actually buy things that are foreign when they're coming in, which is many cases the only things that they can afford. And that means all he's doing is harming the actual consumer. The way the economy works is you have businesses selling to the consumer. The government is not an actual player. The actual workers are only merely an actual assistance to the actual business. And when you harm the business, you harm the worker. That means they can't use the worker as well when you actually harm the business, and that's what tariffs do. That's why tariffs in many cases are something that you'll find that are favored by Marxist ideologues out there. The Marxists actually believe in a lot of tariffs. You'll find these things, ideas that have been favored by such people as Bernie Sanders. And the reason why is because he has this idea that everything should be around the actual idea of the worker and not to the idea of the business and the consumer. He doesn't respect the ideas of the businesses nor the consumer. And this is the idea of this so-called idea on fair trade. There's no such thing as fair trade. The only real fair trade is free trade. And it doesn't matter if they're subsidizing, nor does it matter if they're putting tariffs on their own people. You should continue with free trade, because what it's going to do is going to benefit your own people, because they're going to be able to get products that are going to help them make more as what they can do is use them as component parts or as what they can actually buy directly, which is going to raise the standard of living for your own people. We found this with countries such as Hong Kong. Hong Kong, basically, they have free trade, and while they might not have the personal liberties right now, they still retain those economic liberties, which is why they've been a very very popular place, uh, because they can actually have these economic liberties that they don't have in the United States, because we have still piles and piles of economic regulations that we still have here that Trump has not done a thing to deal with. In fact, he's actually added things to it. Now, when we start to look at some of the things that people try to state that he is trying to be pro-life, we have some things that have actually can dispute this. The first thing is, when we start to look at it, is people try to as we can look at him being on police reform. Now, the best thing you could do for police reform is end qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is merely allowing police officers to basically be accountable for what they do. This is merely what it is. That's all it counts for. It basically means that if they do something in a civil case, they are fully financially accountable for their actions. And by basically being against this, he is actually, all he's doing, he's basically backing a public union so that they do not have to be accountable. And this means what's going to have to happen with it is that for a you're going to have a case in which there's overwhelming evidence for a judge to waive it. Now, the only case in which we can actually note in which it's ever been waived recently was actually by Judge Amy Coney Barrett, in which a person was uh, violating the suspect's rights, and she found the excuses of it to be unbearable, and she waived the cop's ability to use qualified immunity, because she did not find any legitimate reason for him to actually not be not able to hold himself accountable for what he did, and she actually waived his immunity right in court. And that's but this is a very very rare case with it, because what how qualified immunity came in, it was actually through the courts, and the only way it really can be removed is right now is through legislation, because the courts in many cases still recognize this because they give cops the benefit of the doubt. And this is what we need to understand. And we need to understand that this is how it came through. So if we want to actually get this stuff through, we need to understand that if Trump actually is serious about any of this and actually looks out for people that are actually having uh, relations with the police and want to make it better and want to be pro-life in this case with it, and want to make relations between police and the citizens far better, he needs to basically say the police are responsible for their actions and are 100% financially liable for anything they do, uh, just as citizens are financially liable for 100% of whatever they do. And this is something in which it's about just creating a system where everybody's equal under the law. And there's really no reason that we cannot have this. It's just merely that he wants to protect the union, and this is something in which we're finding that is another situation that we find that he is basically showing himself as adopting another Marxist idea. Another one is basically where people try to state that, oh, he has not added any wars. Well, guess what? The one in Yemen, yes, he did add another war to that one, but he's basically escalated war in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan too. Now, what he's done to avoid some of these things on being reported is he will not report on a lot of the facts on these things with it to avoid the actual outcome of these. But yes, he has escalated every one of these wars. And even though he's not added any, he's actually escalated every single one of them. And that's why when it comes down to when people say, is he going to actually leave when he makes these promises? No, he has no intention of it. And that's why he's not getting any legitimate libertarian support. When we start to look at the next part, which is we see federal executions uh, to resume after nearly 2 decade hiatus. I mean, we're talking he's doing that with it. That's another thing that's against being pro-life as well. This is something else that's on top of that. And if you start, and this is something that we need to look at as well, that he's not exactly someone who would be adopting a pro-life idea, and this is something in which we can tell that if someone was pro-life, they would actually adopt the idea of life without parole. And it doesn't matter how you feel about the crime, you still need to adopt the idea that life without parole is far better if you're going to adopt that idea of being really pro-life. Either you're pro-life or you're not. There is no halfway in between. Now, when we start to look at the this one, this is actually a group that he's basically taken advice from, specifically through Stephen Miller. Now, what does the Federation for American Immigration Reform have to do with being pro-life? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because the fact is, when we start to look at the original founder, uh, that would be John Tanton. He was actually a eugenics supporter. And then when you start to look at one of the other uh, one of the other people on uh, the actual board for them, that was a former historian of labor movement and director of the Center for Study of Democratic Institutions, Otis Graham Jr., and also he had Sidney Swenstron, a former chairman of Gulf Oil and governing board member of Planned Parenthood. Now, if you know anything about Planned Parenthood, they're not exactly the institution for being pro-life. Their whole business is abortion. This exactly explains why he has never done anything to actually defund Planned Parenthood. Why he's only done kind of like these fake things, and why he'll go to these things about these rallies, but he will not actually do anything. And the fact is with it is because this group with it follows the whole agenda of basically the progressive 1920s agenda of based of what they actually included with it, which is basically the same ideas as you would have found with people like Margaret Sanger. And when we start to look at it, we see that basically is they're no different, and they had just as much hatred and wanted to uh, change the actual ideas of how people were trying to live their life. They wanted you'll find the same groups of the ideas of nationalist conservatism basically go with the idea of that there's this whole idea of where you're going to have this mass migration. You'll find a lot of people on this idea, and basically you'll these are the whole points that they tend to make, and that we find with this group that they're trying to say that they need to get zero population growth from these groups. Well, that's the reason why is because they go with this idea that the white population is diminishing, and it's because these immigrants and of the different groups of the different colors, and we need to eliminate them from coming to the country, and they want to pause on immigration. And that's their whole idea on pause with it is merely they might state pause on certain things with it, but they actually want to stop it. And it's not only illegal immigration, they actually want to stop overall immigration. Now, this is something in which that's he's taking these ideas that have actually come from eugenics groups. And these eugenics groups go back to the same people as Planned Parenthood. And when we look at Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger, we know that she actually had correspondences with Adolf Hitler. Now, it's not saying that directly that people like Trump are directly linked to it, but we know that Stephen Miller, who's responsible for the policy, Stephen Miller and Mike Pompeo are pretty much controlling 100% of the policy coming out. We know that when it comes down to immigration, 100% of the policy is Stephen Miller. Now, Stephen Miller is basically, when it comes down to it, he's always had this idea of hatred toward these groups when there's no legitimacy to it. When we start to look at the, even just when it comes to crime, we know that what it called, they actually, when we look at even just racially, there's no, what it called, there's no actual legitimate evidence that says that even Hispanics, which is, they seem to have a problem with Hispanics, that Hispanics actually have higher crime levels. When it comes down to comparing homicide rates, and this is under the Obama administration numbers, which what it calls, which they were compiling the stuff for a while, and this is basically they found that Hispanics and whites actually committed homicide per their demographics at the same rates, about 90% of what their actual rates should actually be. When we actually look at comparing that with basically groups that were like, let's say, Asian, Native American, Alaska Native, Pacific Islander, Middle Easterner, those usually have numbers that are usually basically lower than 40% than what they should have an allowance from with it. Now, while we look at the whole thing with it, now you'd probably think that Barack Obama's FBI would have produced false numbers for blacks, but that while they were actually, in fact, 280% of the actual allotted amount, and then for ones that were actually unknown, they would be at 100% because that would be a mixture of the whole bunch. Now, under these ideas with it, they would assume that your ones that would be on the mixture of the groups with it, and the Latinos should actually be the highest amount under their ideas, which shows you that they're actually completely wrong, that they don't do that with it. When it comes down to the actual usage of public aid, we know that due to actually rules on the actual books, they're not eligible for public aid. So they're not using them with it. The only times when they actually use public aid, and they use it at lower levels than actually people that are native born citizens, they're actually using them at actually lower amounts, and they're only using them because of one reason, because the actual laws to actually work in the country are actually set up against them. Because the fact is, there's a lot of regulations on the books. If you eliminate the regulations for these people to work that have actually been set up through cronyism, this is where you get this is where the actual problem comes from. And it's through groups like this that have actually created all of the cronyism that have actually meant to actually undermine American workers. When they say, oh, they're for the American worker, no, these groups are actually for undermining the American workers to make sure that there's more, to make sure that the American workers can't get work because they've overpriced themselves for it, and then make sure that they support all this extra spending of money, so that basically when it comes down to it is there's highly against actual reductions in the budget, because they're not actually for cutting the budget, therefore actually exploding the budget when it comes down to it. Now, when we actually look at what's actually viable, I mean, I know I'm going off on immigration on this with it, but it still is an actual important topic. Now, when we look at that, we actually see that we need to go back to the Federal 72 and the opinion of our first Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay, in which you will find that the term migration actually refers to the term of basically the movement of slaves when they were actually being sold. There is no actual term for immigration. Immigration is not an actual term that is actually shown in the United States. There is no actual term when it comes down to that, number one. And number two, when it comes to citizenship, they can actually, that's actually controlled, and that's actually applied for later after these, and that's applied for within a government test that can actually be done in whatever way that they seem fit with a actual civics test. They can do an English test if they want to do with it. Now there's questions on if that's legitimate, but some people feel it is, some people feel it's not. But basically, the only one that everybody agrees on that's legitimate is a civics test. And the idea of a language test is, some people feel it's legitimate, some people don't. But when we come down to it, is the actual thing is we have the actual thing on the books saying that restriction of immigration, as we see it, of what immigration is, letting the people in the country, is actually unconstitutional. And this is it was mainly created by people that were actually started within the progressive era. These are these actual people that were actually eugenicists. And it all starts in with that. And that's why you find the same people that now that were actually doing it back then. You'll find the same people that do it with that. You'll find the same people back then with it that were doing it. And they basically, that's their little scapegoat. And they create the same type of scapegoat as they did back then. And you'll find with it that it's not much different than the socialist movement. The socialist movement try to create a scapegoat based on a monetary amount, whereas these people try to create a racial scapegoat. This is no different. And when we start to look at it with it, we see that the Trump administration is not pro-life. It is not concerned about debt. As you see with it, when you start to look at things like national conservatism, you'll see their ideas. They're not concerned about debt. They're actually concerned about this idea of moral legislation. And when we start to look at it, when you start to look at some of the liberty scholars, throughout the ages from going back from the ideas of Thomas Aquinas up to current day, you'll actually find that you cannot legislate morality. Morality comes from within. You're not going to be able to legislate that. And this is something in which we find that these are people that are no different than where you started at, that they were basically they were basically want to do these unconstitutional things. This is why we find a lot of things in which they want to use force and government violence to get their way. This is where we got the idea of both the war on drugs, which is unconstitutional, and where they initially started the idea of the alcohol prohibition. Alcohol prohibition was because they felt that there were too many people drinking, and they thought that if they outlaw alcohol with it, that it would basically create a great solution. Well, what they found out is that it would basically create this whole big system for crime. They eventually learned that it was a huge mistake, but we still haven't learned on the idea of drugs. They think that they basically can this whole same group with it still believes in the war on drugs as well, which is not only is it unconstitutional, not only does it involve government violence, and all these ideas of these nationalists around the globe believe in it, but it actually has empowered these communist groups around the globe. In fact, you have a lot of power within Colombia from the actual drug cartels in the Communist Party, and that's directly because of our war on drugs. You actually have the actual whole increase in our heroin amount from our intervention in Afghanistan. The amount of heroin around the globe that was directly from that. And this is what we get from actually intervening in people's affairs and what ends up occurring. And we are told, oh, we can't get rid of those drugs with it because then what ends up happening is you'll anger the cartels. And this is the whole thing with it. Now we have a government that's in league with the cartels. And the same thing right now with it is our government is both fighting the cartels and in league with the cartels at the same damn time. And if you don't understand this with it, what's actually happening with it, that's what's occurring. And all they're doing is they're basically incarcerating people for nonviolent offenses. And it's this idea of trying to legislate the idea of what morality should be. And this is what we found back in the 1920s under the Progressive Era, and this is what we're finding now. That's why this is not conservatism. This Federation for American Immigration Reform should not be linked in with some of these other conservatives. The idea it should be linked in is people like FDR and other people like Woodrow Wilson. That's the people it should be linked with. FDR and Woodrow Wilson were the ones that it was linked with, and that was actually the Democratic Party. That's why when you start to look at the thing with, you'll actually see that. And we found that what it called with like Woodrow Wilson, he did an airing of Birth of a Nation, which was by the KKK, in his actual White House, and he said it watched like an actual documentary, even though it was meant to actually demean blacks. And we've actually found this time and time again that this is what this idea of legislating morale is meant to do. And we found that this is exactly what it's done. Woodrow Wilson was also the one that put in the income tax. He was also the one that put in the Federal Reserve. These are things that actually destroyed our actual system with it. Ones that have actually did good as actual president was William Howard Taft, was actually one who actually went through and was one that was for free trade, and that actually went against his own party to actually do things good when he was actually president. Now we look at something, this is why when we start to look at these things, we should understand what's actually going on and why Trump is not this idea of this supporting liberty and supporting freedom. This is something in which we find that these people are against these ideas of liberty and freedom. They're actually for ideas of they're actually for the ideas of basically more government and uh, basically basically their ideas of more they love the ideas of more government and more oppression, because if you look at the way it was started with it is basically it was started out of the ideas of Planned Parenthood and the Sierra Club. Those aren't exactly right-wing groups, and that's the whole thing with it is this is what's you're finding the Federation for American Immigration Reform was established by, and it's completely different from what we find legitimacy with when it comes down to what we should look when we look at immigration. We should actually look to what our actual founders, what some of the early people stated with it. And this is something which we should basically be looking to what it actually means. And we shouldn't be looking to the abuses of the Commerce Clause, in which why they've stated why we can actually have immigration law. Now, frankly, with it, a person going across the border is not an actual transaction. This is their actual excuse of why we've actually have ever allowed it from to begin with. Frankly, none of this is actually legitimate, and is basically, I mean, if you look at with the whole thing with it is you'll find like their group with it is they're part of this umbrella thing of basically coalition for the future American worker, basically, and part of this whole thing of Numbers USA. Basically, all this is basically it's nothing but it's all this is basically nothing but pretty much communist propaganda that they're basically running with it and out of this stuff with it because they don't uh, believe in actually the ideas of free trade and free movement of people. And that's the whole thing. And you find the same types of things, and this is just rehashing what we've had before in the past. And that's why when we look at the actual debt, he wasn't going to shrink the debt because he doesn't believe that. It was more about this moral obligation to everything, to trying to basically put in this idea of this us versus them on this tribalism that was part of this nationalist garbage. And this whole thing of basically that there's this group out to get us, and it's always another group out to get us. It doesn't matter if it's the media, it could be the Democrats or the globalists with it, which is a umbrella term that they try to state. Basically, anybody who doesn't support basically this America is the only country in the world with it, and we need to enforce our way on everybody, and basically beat it over the head of everybody with it. If you don't support everything America does, including bombing innocent civilians, with it, you're basically a globalist. And that's basically the whole idea with it is this cult-like following. And this is why when we see that it was basically no different with Trump with it than what we saw with Obama. Obama had this cult-like following, which is basically the same type of process, and we saw the same type of repeated thing, and it was very disturbing because we saw that Obama could do no wrong, just like people say Trump can do no wrong. Well, the fact is, if you act in a very, very objective way, you're going to see that basically both exploded the debt when both were explaining that the debt was basically uh, something in which it was irresponsible spending. Both were uh, both said that the wars were out overseas were pointless. Both have yet to actually do anything about that, and both have actually raised the actual amount of military spending. It's not defense spending. Defense spending, you only need about $250 billion, and that would be excessive amount just to guard the actual country itself, and that allows us our territories, the actual 48 states, the territories, and Alaska and Hawaii, and that's it. And that would be what it called. That would be guarded to the highest possible level. And yet, what we see is we see that it's exploded to basically 3 times that amount. Potentially this year it could be 4 times that amount. And we see that he's exploded it and believed the whole myth that our defensive was actually obliterated. Because when we look at the actual Obama defense budget, we actually find that he actually spent his actual budget actually rose 50% above what Bush was spending. Now, if we were actually now if he actually gutted it, shouldn't he have actually spent less? Well, the fact is he didn't spend less than Bush. He actually spent far more than Bush, and no one was actually calling him out on that. And the fact is, last year there was actually found there was $125 billion worth of waste, even just in a generic audit. Now there's probably more of waste with it, but that was what they found. Now what does Trump do? Trump awards them immediately with basically $175 billion in extra money immediately once he gets in. And this is exactly what he did out of the gate. Immediately gets them more money. Instead of actually cutting their money and actually bring us down to mid 400s, which is where we would have been if we would have done it without waste, he does that, which shows he was not concerned about that, because his advisors like Stephen Miller were telling him not to do that. And then he has gone against everything with it. And then when it comes down to the group that's advising him on immigration, the group that's basically pushing for him on immigration, that's basically another swamp group that basically spends about in 2016 they were spending over 11 million. They're probably spending far more now. They're another swamp group out there, Federation for American Immigration Reform. We could tell it that this linked to former people of Planned Parenthood, and produce still with the same ideas of eugenics. We can tell that he doesn't have any serious ideas of being pro-life at all. He can go to any of these pro-life rallies, but it doesn't mean anything unless you show action. There is not going to ever be action with it. When it comes down to it, you're never going to find links to this group with people that are actually serious about liberty. You're only going to find links to this group with people that actually want to violate your liberty. And that's why you will never find anybody that's actually linked to this group that actually is serious about liberty. They actually want to actually violate that. You'll find people that are actually talking about crazy conspiracy theories about mass migration that don't exist. Mass migration only happens when you have a third party assisting it. The mass migration that actually happened in Europe was actually recently from the Arab Spring. That was actually assisted from intervention by the United States when we were actually trying to when us, Israel, and the Saudi Arabia were trying to destabilize the Middle East. And this is what actually happened. We actually were funding, along with Israel and Saudi Arabia, we are funding terrorist groups to destabilize the Middle East. And this is under Obama. And this is what ended up occurring was it ended up creating we ended up creating a huge refugee problem. The refugees wanted to end up leaving, and they left in droves and left north. Some of the people that ended up following up north with it were the actual terrorist groups as well. that's going to be naturally occurring with it as well that's going to happen because they're going to want to expand on that caliphate that they wanted. Now, on top of this, with it, we've had that. We've also had a system in which we go back to it. The other one would have been the idea of uh, when we had uh, the slave trade. This is basically natural movement of slaves through the actual trade, and that's directly done through the British and through the United States, amongst others, that actually moved them through the Caribbean and South America into the United States and up to Britain. And these were through the Columbian Exposition, and we found that was a big one. The other one would have been the actual normal migration of people with it when there were actually land bridges through different areas with it. Now, this wasn't as much of a mass migration because there wasn't as high amounts of people. But the only ones that we actually had in what we've called like what we would probably call like somewhat within a modern history, since we've actually been a civilized people, would have actually been those two. One of which was actually a slave trade, the other of which was actually due to a caliphate. Now, these caliphates have actually caused some bit of a movement uh, when they actually happen. Now, specifically, this last one was actually caused due to intervention within the United States and Israel because they wanted to reshape the Middle East. Now, if we didn't go in, nor did we, and if we actually start to defund our actual intervention in the Middle East, as well as do not fund any Middle Eastern countries, what's going to happen is you're going to find that there's not going to be one country in the Middle East that ends up causing this because they're not going to have the excess funds nor the actual support. And if there's going to be an act, and especially if we start removing sanctions, you're going to actually see a check in what ends up happening. And that will actually completely eliminate what they're actually calling for. Now, the actual idea of this fear of people coming in on this massive level with it, it's not going to happen with it when you actually have normal, without borders, without an actual physical border. Because when we've actually seen previously with it, we've actually had times in our country without physical borders for a long time, and where there's actually far more opportunity with it, where the actual amount of public aid is far less meaningful than the actual jobs that they can actually get within the country, and that would be and the actual ability to rise up. It was more meaningful with it when our actual monetary system was actually meaningful and we were actually backed by something, not just massive amounts of debt. And that's why what we would see is we would see people coming here naturally in fair amounts with it and coming in and contributing. But ever since we've actually put these unconstitutional immigration laws in with it, we've actually harmed our actual economy. And we've actually seen some of these people like some of these people that have actually been like crackpots that have actually wanted to continue it. And that this is a of the actually destruction of the actual system. And we find that basically we find that a lot of these people that were actually they're actually pushing these things with it are not actually within the actual what we would call the conservative ideology of what would be considered legitimate. Uh, we would traditionally what it calls see what it, we would traditionally consider the what's legitimate as this is right here is right libertarianism is what it called as really the only thing as legitimate in conservatism as the what we would actually call the what's would be actually legitimate what would be actually legitimate conservatism in the actual idea. And this is the whole idea in which we should basically be taking in which we should be taking the actual parties with it. And then this is why when we look at some of the people like uh, Reagan, this is why Reagan was actually considered to be uh, an actual person that's was actually beloved by the party with it, and he said he believes that in the whole heart of and soul of conservatism is libertarianism, and this is actually something in which should be taken at heart with the whole thing, and that basically we should be ignoring the ideas of this uh, nationalism within the party. Nationalism is exactly the opposite. This is something which is a left wing idea and that is somehow embraced the right wing out of nowhere. And it's come out of, it's originally came out of the 1920s progressive era, which was a left wing ideology that's basically really rooted in socialism. And this is the whole thing is that there is no place for nationalism in a true conservative ideology, and that's why when we find these things with it is that that's why you're not finding that Trump is actually serious about any of these things when it comes to being against what it calls against reducing debt, against what it calls actually getting people back to work through actually what it calls developing opportunities for business and actually being pro-life, because you're not going to find pro-life from this actual movement. It doesn't exist. It's basically it's a dead idea. It's basically this idea of basically trying to morally engineer people, which is the idea of the left. The left actually wants to morally engineer people. Their whole point is actually on the ideas of the social end with it. The whole idea of on the conservative end should solely be on the economic end with it, and they should basically be pushing on the idea uh, of liberty on it. Basically if it doesn't push for more economic freedom with it, they should be basically not even concerned with it. Specifically, they should actually be pushing for more social liberty as well, because that would be the best way to actually encourage more economic liberty. Because if someone is, the more content someone is, the more they're actually going to enter into the market and be positive. And this is the whole idea with it, and the idea that the government and public money only wastes the actual money. This is why the ideas of tariffs are not a conservative idea. Tariffs are actually sending money to the state. When you send money to the state that is actually non-productive money, The only way you can get productive money is allowing people to keep it. This is the whole idea with it. Why the whole point actually is uh, centered around keeping money in the people's hands. Keep money in the people's hands, they can actually determine what it actually comes to. And that's why the libertarian right is actually the only way to actually go for the actual party. And you need to eliminate the ideas of uh, this nationalism, because the fact is this nationalism is just destructive. If you want to be patriotic, be patriotic. That's just fine with it. We have plenty of countries around the world that are patriotic. Be happy about your country with it. Be glad of what the founding documents say for your country with it. But the fact is do not basically be a slave to your own country and say whatever they do is right, because you should start questioning when your country is wrong and doing something. And that's the thing with it, what nationalism doesn't teach you to do. They teach you to basically, just like in mainland China, they teach you to basically be a slave and to actually worship the actual country no matter what they do. If they're killing someone, if they're killing an innocent person with it, you have to cheer it on. And that's what's happening. That's what happens with nationalism. Now, patriotism would be what the ideas of what we have with free speech. You're supposed to actually condemn your nation when they actually do something wrong, when they're actually going with the ideas of force. And I'm basically going to end it right here because I think I've covered the ground of where I need to, and that's about it. And bye, everyone.